Hi guys, it's a beautiful day today. It's Thursday, March 26th. I thought I would come outside and enjoy some sunshine and share the next chapter of The Littles with you. Chapter 7. Mr. Little and Tom were not the only Littles who fought with mice that day. Uncle Pete and Lucy had a narrow escape in the cellar. They had been burning trash at the hot water heater when two mice trapped them. Uncle Pete and Lucy were under the water tank next to the burner, and there was no safe way out. There you can see Lucy and how close that mouse got to her. It must have been very frightening. At first, Uncle Pete tried to fight them off with his bow and arrows, but the old bowstring broke with the first shot, and he missed. Luckily, Uncle Pete had made 2 torches from burnt matches he found near the heater. He had wrapped rags around the ends of the matchsticks. Then he dipped them in a puddle of oil near the furnace. When the bowstring broke, Uncle Pete lit the torches. He and Lucy waved them at the mice and frightened them away. Back in the safety of their rooms, Uncle Pete made a new bowstring. He waxed it carefully and strung it on the bow. "Someone's going to get hurt if this keeps up," said Mrs. Little. "When are the Newcombs going to help us?" "Probably never," said Uncle Pete. "Tom has a plan," said Mr. Little. "It's a good plan, and I think it will work. Tell your idea, Tom." "Well," said Tom, "those Newcombs never see the mice, so they don't bother to set traps, right?" Tom's mother nodded. "Suppose we show them a mouse. Then they'll know, right?" "How do we do that?" said Uncle Pete. "We don't have any mice. Your mouse got away, and my bowstring broke. We don't want them to see a dead mouse anyway," said Mr. Little. "Then what on earth is the boy talking about?" said Uncle Pete. "Get to the point." "Suppose I dressed up like a mouse," said Tom. "I could run across the kitchen floor right in front of Mrs. Newcomb." "Good heavens," said Uncle Pete. "Is the woman an idiot? Couldn't she tell a fake mouse from a real one?" "If the fake mouse went fast enough," said Mrs. Little, "she might think it was real." "There's only one thing wrong with Tom's plan," said Mr. Little. "I'll do the mouse running. As head of the family, it's my job." "But Dad, you're too big," said Tom. "I'm just the right size. It won't look right if you do it." "Oh dear," said Mrs. Little. "Do you think so?" "The boy's right," said Uncle Pete. "If we're going to use his plan, let's do it right. He's the perfect size for the job." It was decided. Tom would play the part of the mouse. Mr. Little would go with him to tell him when and where to run. Granny Little set to work making the costume. By the next afternoon, they were ready. Tom was dressed in the costume. He looked quite a bit like a real mouse, even from close up. Granny Little had done her work well. She had sewn on ears and whiskers. Tom used his own tail, of course. His mother oiled and brushed down the hair so it had the shape of a mouse's tail. Here you can see Granny Little hard at work sewing the costume. And then here's Mrs. Little and Granny helping Tom get dressed up and ready for the plan. "Tom, you look a fright," said Mr. Little. Uncle Pete came into the room. "Mrs. Newcomb's in the kitchen now," he said. "It's time you two got moving." Just a minute, said Granny Little. She was on her knees making some last-minute changes. "It's too loose around the ankles. You don't want to trip, do you?" Lucy stood behind her mother, sneaking looks at Tom. "Mother, doesn't he look awful?" she said. "I want to see myself in the mirror," said Tom. Hold still, said Granny Little. She worked for a moment longer. There, she stood up and looked at her work. "Granny, it's wonderful," said Mrs. Little. "It's awful," said Lucy. The family followed Tom as he squeaked and galloped on all fours over to the mirror. "Tom," said Mr. Little, "this is not a joke. I want you to remember that." "I'm practicing," said Tom. "The boy is high-spirited, that's all," said Uncle Pete. "I was that way myself when I was his age." Mr. Little had to pull his son away from the mirror. "Come, Tom," he said, "we're wasting time. Mrs. Newcomb may not be in the kitchen for long." All the Littles went with Mr. Little and Tom down the passageway as far as the tin can elevator. Mrs. Little tried to kiss Tom, but the mouse costume covered his head. Instead, she pulled his tail gently. "Be careful, Tom. Do just as your father tells you," she said. "He'll be all right," said Mr. Little. "He knows what to do. We've gone over it and over it." "What's all the fuss?" said Uncle Pete. "They'll be back shortly." Mr. Little and Tom climbed into the tin can. They had rigged up the tin can elevator from an old soup can and bits of string tied together. The elevator dropped slowly out of sight. And here you can see the tin can elevator that they're describing that they made. "It's the first time any of the big people have ever seen any of us," said Mrs. Little. "And the only real part of Tom they'll see is his tail." Down in the kitchen, Mr. Little hid behind a wastebasket. He got ready to give Tom the signal to go. The tiny man held up his hand, waiting for the right moment. If Mrs. Newcomb was too close, she might step on Tom. But if she weren't facing the right way, she might not see Tom run across the floor. Mr. Little waited. Tom watched his father carefully. Mrs. Newcomb turned toward the wastebasket where Mr. Little was hiding. Mr. Little's hand dropped. Just then, Mrs. Newcomb started walking. "No, Tom, wait," whispered Mr. Little. Too late. Tom Little came skittering across the kitchen floor just in time to run between Mrs. Newcomb's feet. Mr. Little closed his eyes. "Eee!" shouted Mrs. Newcomb. "A mouse!" Mr. Little opened his eyes. Tom was safe under the radiator on the other side of the room. "Charlie!" shouted Mrs. Newcomb. "There's a mouse in the kitchen." Mr. Newcomb came running. "This house has mice," said Mrs. Newcomb. "One of them almost jumped on me." "Take it easy, Liz," said Mr. Newcomb. He got down on his knees and looked around. "Charlie, you must get rid of the mice," said Mrs. Newcomb. "I won't live in a house with mice." "We'll get rid of them," said Mr. Newcomb. "The Biggs must have some mouse traps around someplace. Just don't get so excited, Liz. It's only a little mouse." And here you can see how close Tom had to get to Mrs. Newcomb when he ran through her feet. "Don't get excited, you say," said Mrs. Newcomb. "You should have seen it. It ran straight at me. It might have bitten me. It came so close." "You think a mouse would bite you?" said Mr. Newcomb. "You can't tell," said Mrs. Newcomb. "You never can tell what a wild animal like that will do." I hope you enjoyed that chapter, and I'll see you next time for Chapter 8. Bye.